activity, we need energy. This energy is obtained from the breakdown of organic molecules such as sugars, fats and proteins inside the body's cells. During the process of breaking down of organic molecules, the cells continuously use oxygen and release carbon dioxide. To provide fresh oxygen to the cells and to remove carbon dioxide, which is harmful to them, living organisms inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. This process of inhaling and exhaling is called breathing. The process of breathing, accompanied by the breakdown of foods to produce energy, is called respiration. However, the mechanism of breathing varies depending on the habitat and level of organization of an animal. Lower invertebrates such as sponges, coelenterids, and flatworms exchange gases by simple diffusion through their body surface. In insects such as cockroaches and earthworms, tubular extensions of the body wall, called tracheae, and moist skin help transport atmospheric air throughout the body. Most mollusks use special vascularized structures called ctenidium for gaseous exchange. Some arthropods, such as spiders and scorpions, use many thin folds of membrane resembling the pages of a book for respiration. These are called book lungs. Terrestrial forms of vertebrates use vascularized bags called lungs. Among vertebrates, fishes respire through gills, whereas amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals respire through lungs. Apart from lungs, frogs can also respire through their skin. Among all animals, mammals have the most well-developed respiratory system. In humans, it consists of respiratory organs such as the respiratory tract and lungs. The respiratory tract includes the nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, and bronchi. The nose is made up of cartilage and bone. While inhaling, it warms, moistens, and filters air that enters the body through the nostrils. This air then passes through the nasal chamber. The nasal chamber opens into the pharynx, which is the common passage for food and air. The pharynx opens through the glottis of the larynx region into the trachea. The larynx is a cartilaginous box, also called the sound box, because it helps in sound production. The glottis is covered by a thin, elastic cartilaginous flap called the epiglottis that prevents the entry of food into the larynx. The trachea is a tubular passage that allows air into the lungs. It is made up C-shaped cartilaginous rings and is divided into two branches called primary bronchi. Each primary bronchus undergoes repeated divisions to form the secondary and tertiary bronchi, ending up in very thin terminal bronchioles. The terminal bronchioles connect to ducts called alveolar ducts that open into tiny, spongy, air-filled sacs called alveoli, which look almost like a bunch of grapes. An average adult's lungs contain about 600 million alveoli. Each alveolus is covered by
Hello, hola, bonjour. जी हाँ,
capillaries, which combine to form the pulmonary vein. The pulmonary vein carries purified blood to the heart, and from the heart, the pulmonary artery carries impure blood to the lungs. Bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli form a part of a pair of lungs, the left lung and the right lung. The left lung has two lobes and is slightly smaller because of the location of the heart near it. The right lung is bigger with three lobes. The lobes are spongy and elastic organs with broad bottoms and tapering tops. Each lung is enclosed by two membranes, the outer pleural membrane and the inner pleural membrane. The outer pleural membrane is in close contact with the thoracic lining, whereas the inner pleural membrane is in contact with the lung's surface. The membranes enclose a space called the pleural cavity that contains pleural fluid. Pleural fluid reduces friction on the lung's surface when the lungs expand and contract. The lungs are situated in the airtight thoracic chamber. A thick membranous structure below the lungs separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. It is called the diaphragm. The thoracic chamber is supported by the vertebral column dorsally, by the sternum ventrally, by the ribs laterally, and by the dome-shaped diaphragm on the lower side. The lungs in the thorax are arranged so that any change in the volume of the thoracic cavity reflects on the lung cavity or pulmonary cavity. Based on function, the respiratory system is divided into two parts, the conducting part and the respiratory part. The conducting part spreads from the external nostrils to the terminal bronchioles. It transports atmospheric air to the alveoli, clears it of foreign particles, and humidifies the air. The respiratory part contains the alveoli and the alveolar ducts. The actual diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide between blood and atmospheric air takes place in the alveoli of the respiratory part. Observe your breath. Your chest expands every time you breathe in and contracts every time you breathe out. This is because breathing causes the movement in lung and chest muscles to maintain the body at equilibrium pressure. Let's study respiration in detail. Respiration involves breathing, external respiration, internal transport, internal respiration, and cellular respiration. Breathing is a two-step process. The first step, called inspiration, involves taking in air from the atmosphere inside the body, and the second step, expiration, involves releasing air from the body into the atmosphere. During inspiration, the diaphragm is pulled down. This causes the intercostal muscles to lift up the ribs and the sternum, thus expanding the rib cage. This increases the volume of the thoracic cavity, causing the pressure inside to decrease. This action allows air to enter the body cavity, making the lungs expand. The expiration process is just the opposite of the inspiration process. In expiration, the diaphragm and intercostal muscles relax. This returns the thoracic cavity to its original volume and increases the air pressure in the lungs. As the air pressure inside the lungs is higher than the atmospheric pressure, the second stage of respiration is called external respiration, and it involves diffusion of gases across the alveolar membrane. The diffusion membrane is made up of three major layers, namely the thin squamous epithelium of alveoli, the endothelium of alveolar capillaries, and the basement substance in between them. Alveoli are the primary sites of exchange of gases. The thickness of its membrane is less than a millimeter. Carbon dioxide is 20 to 25 times more soluble than oxygen. Hence, the amount of carbon dioxide that can diffuse through the diffusion membrane is much higher compared to that of oxygen. The diffused gases are carried by the blood from the lungs to different organs of the body. This is called gas transport. Blood from heart enters the lungs through the pulmonary artery, arterioles, and alveolar capillaries. In lungs, oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged between blood.
Are you experiencing knowing-doing trap?
This blood then flows out of the alveolar capillaries through venules and back to the heart via the pulmonary veins. Heart pumps this oxygen-rich blood to different tissues. Hemoglobin in the blood transports the oxygen. The diffusion of gases between the blood and the tissues is called internal respiration. The oxygen that is carried to the tissues is used by cells to produce ATP. ATP is produced by the breaking down of organic molecules. This process is called cellular respiration. Thus, respiration takes place in humans. We have seen how we breathe. But can we measure how much we can breathe? An average lung can hold about 6 liters of air, of which only a small amount is used during normal breathing. The volume of gas contained within the lungs is called respiratory volumes. And different combinations of lung volumes are called respiratory capacities. The volume of air inspired and expired by the lungs can be estimated by using a procedure called spirometry. Let's discuss the respiratory volumes and respiratory capacities. Volume of air inspired or expired during each normal breath is called tidal volume. A healthy man can inspire or expire approximately 6,000 to 8,000 milliliters of air per minute. Inspiratory reserve volume is the additional volume of air that a person can inspire by a maximal inspiration. This usually happens during exercise or exertion when we need to breathe forcibly. This averages from 2,500 milliliters to 3,000 milliliters. The additional volume of air that a person can expire by a maximal expiration is called expiratory reserve volume. This averages from 1,000 milliliters to 1,100 milliliters. The volume of air that remains in the lungs after a maximal expiration is called residual volume. This averages from 1,100 milliliters to 1,200 milliliters. The total volume of air a person can inspire after a normal expiration is his inspiratory capacity. This includes both tidal volume and inspiratory reserve volume. Total volume of air a person can expire after a normal inspiration is called his expiratory capacity. This includes both tidal volume and the expiratory reserve volume. Volume of air that remains in the lungs after a normal expiration is called functional residual capacity. This includes both expiratory reserve volume and residual volume. Volume of maximal inspiration after a forced expiration or volume of maximal expiration after a forced inspiration is known as vital capacity. This includes the expiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, and inspiratory reserve volume. It is approximately 3 liters. The total volume of air accommodated in the lungs after maximal inspiration is known as total lung capacity. This includes residual volume, expiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, and inspiratory reserve volume. It is this capacity of our lungs that allows swimmers, long-distance runners, cyclists, and other athletes to maintain their stamina, pace, and speed required to win a race. We know that exchange of gases occurs primarily between alveoli, blood, and tissues. It takes place on the basis of pressure and concentration gradients using simple diffusion. The concentration gradient for oxygen and carbon dioxide from alveoli to blood and blood to tissues differs with the difference of partial pressure at the sites of diffusion. Partial pressure is pressure contributed by an individual gas in a mixture of gases. It is represented as PO2 for oxygen and PCO2 for carbon dioxide. This diagram denotes partial pressure for oxygen and carbon dioxide in different parts of the body, with the concentration gradient for oxygen and carbon dioxide from alveoli to blood, blood to tissues, and vice versa. As carbon dioxide is 20 to 25 times more soluble than oxygen, the amount of carbon dioxide that can diffuse through the diffusion membrane is much more than that of oxygen. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported to various organs of the body by blood. About 97% of oxygen is transported by red blood cells, whereas the remaining 3% is carried in a dissolved state through the plasma. Nearly 20 to 25% of carbon dioxide is transported by red blood cells, while 70% of it is carried as bicarbonate, and the remaining 5 to 10% is carried in a dissolved state through plasma. Let's look at the transportation of oxygen from alveoli to tissues. Hemoglobin in the blood binds with oxygen to form oxyhemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a red-colored, iron-containing protein. Each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 molecules of oxygen. The binding of oxygen with hemoglobin is influenced by factors such as partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide, hydrogen ion concentration, and temperature. The percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen, if plotted against the partial pressure of oxygen, results in a sigmoid curve called the oxygen dissociation curve. This curve is used to study the effect of factors such as partial pressure of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion concentration on the binding of oxygen with hemoglobin. Alveoli are more amenable to the formation of oxyhemoglobin as they have high oxygen partial pressure, low carbon dioxide partial pressure, a smaller hydrogen ion concentration, and lower temperature. On the other hand, tissues are amenable to the dissociation of oxygen from oxyhemoglobin as they have low oxygen partial pressure, high carbon dioxide partial pressure, high hydrogen ion concentration, and high temperature. Therefore, oxygen combines with hemoglobin on the surface of the lungs and gets dissociated in the tissues. Now let's understand how carbon dioxide is transported from tissues to alveoli. Carbon dioxide is carried by hemoglobin in blood as carbaminohemoglobin. The binding of carbon dioxide and hemoglobin is high in tissues where carbon dioxide partial pressure is high and oxygen partial pressure is low. On the other hand, when carbon dioxide partial pressure is low and oxygen partial pressure is high, as in alveoli, dissociation of carbon dioxide from carbaminohemoglobin takes place. The carbonic anhydrase enzyme present in red blood cells and plasma facilitates diffusion in tissues and alveoli. In tissues where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high, it diffuses into red blood cells and plasma to form bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. In alveoli, where partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low, carbon dioxide and water are formed. Thus, carbon dioxide, trapped as bicarbonate in red blood cells, is transported to the alveoli and released as carbon dioxide. For every 100 milliliters of deoxygenated blood, hemoglobin releases approximately 4 milliliters of carbon dioxide to the alveoli. The respiratory rhythm is maintained by the human brain. This is regulated by 3 respiratory centers in the pons and medulla region of the brain, called the respiratory rhythm center. It includes the inspiratory center, the expiratory center, and the pneumotaxic center. Neural signals from these centers can reduce the duration of inspiration and thereby alter the respiratory rate. A chemosensitive area adjacent to the rhythm center is highly sensitive to carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions. Hence, the increase of these substances in the blood activates this center, which in turn signals the rhythm center to make adjustments in the respiratory process to eliminate these substances. Asthma and emphysema are disorders of the respiratory system caused by environmental factors. Asthma is characterized by difficulty in breathing due to inflammation of the bronchi and bronchioles. Emphysema is a chronic disorder caused by the rupture of the alveolar walls, which decreases the respiratory surface. In industries involving grinding or stone breaking, Long-term exposure to dust gives rise to inflammation, resulting in fibrosis and lung damage.